Welcome to the Vandy Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Our guest today will be Justin Rowland from CatsIllustrated.com. We will talk Kentucky football. This show presented by the Well Coffee House, which is a Nashville area coffee house that provides fresh roasted coffee along with house-made pastries, breakfast, and lunch offerings. There are 5 locations to serve you in the Nashville area. Those can be found in Brentwood, Green Hills, downtown, Bellevue, and the Cool Springs Lifeway. More information can be found at wellcoffeehouse.org. The Well Coffee House, where coffee changes lives. We also thank our co-sponsor, Wellspire, Nashville's Learning and Development Center, which is located in the Gulch. Today's news presented by Sutherland and Belk, a family-owned injury law firm. If you or a loved one has been hurt in any type of accident, please call Taylor or Russell at 615-846-6200. See what your rights are and if they can help. Well, the honors keep coming in for Vanderbilt baseball coach Tim Corbin. He has been elected to the American Baseball Coaches Hall of Fame as part of its 6-member class for 2020. That induction ceremony will be held in Nashville at the ABCA convention. That'll be Friday, January the 3rd in 2020 at the Gaylord Hotel Opryland. The guest line is brought to you by our friends at Boll & Branch. That was started by Vanderbilt graduates Scott and Missy Tannen. I've slept on Boll & Branch sheets for about a half dozen years now. They are incredible. They last a long time. They are incredibly comfortable. They are fair trade certified. That means they're made under safe conditions by men and women who were treated and paid fairly. Try them free for a month. You can return them if you want to, but you're not going to want to because you're going to love them like I do. Once you get the sheets, try the mattress. That was voted best mattress of 2018. And a special offer for our podcast listeners, go to bollandbranch.com. That is spelled B-O-L-L. Enter the promo code Vandy. Get $50 off your first set of sheets. Justin Rowland joins us now. He is the publisher at CatsIllustrated.com, Kentucky's home on the Rivals.com network. Justin and the guys do a great job of covering Kentucky. Justin's going to tell us more about what to expect from the Wildcats in football this year. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
It's always a pleasure, man. How are you doing?
Doing quite well. It is almost time for fall camp. I know Vandy starts the 1st, which is coming up in 2 days. What's the deal with Kentucky? When do they start?
The 3rd. We've got Media Day on Friday, and so we're going to have our team there for that. And then Saturday is Fan Day, which kicks off the start of fall camp. And Kentucky doesn't let us see much in the way of practice, and that's kind of standard across the SEC, a lot of college football now, which is unfortunate. But they start, and we start to hear what the coaches at least have to say after Saturday. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, I am new to that club. Vanderbilt's access has been tremendous throughout the years I've covered it until this year. It started to change a little bit last year. This year, we got to see 3 hours total of spring practice. That included the spring game. We are not going to get a minute of any of the first 3 practices. We will get 20 minutes each in practices 4, 5, and 6. I presume Kentucky's policy is similar?
Yeah, we get bits and pieces. We'll get about 45 minutes of the first practice, and then maybe 2 of the other practices the first 45 minutes of, and then the spring game. And we don't get any of the other scrimmages or anything like that. So it's a very limited viewing, and we've got to lean on what the coaches are saying and test that information against what we're hearing behind the scenes. But it's kind of a blackout that makes our jobs difficult. And I know the fans wish that there were more, but we go with what we can get. So it's going to be fun either way.
I'm trying to think who in the SEC still has a media-friendly policy. I think Missouri opens up just about everything, maybe. I may be dreaming
it was Missouri.
That, but
Missouri, something like 14 of their practices, I think, are open to media.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is anybody else in that club, or the rest of us kind of in the same boat other than Missouri?
That's the only one off the top of my head. Is Missouri is definitely the outlier, and Barry Odom is the envy of the league's media for that.
Hey, exactly. Well, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, part of me rolls my eyes at it. Another part says this league is so hyper competitive that I kind of get it. I don't know. What do you see as is that worth the trade-off just to lock everybody out and basically, I'm not going to say restrict excitement around your program because fans get it however they can, but I've always wondered Like, what's the trade-off between whatever leaks out that gets into hands of teams they are playing versus the publicity for the program?
I think the competitive advantage or the potential competitive disadvantage thing is kind of a smokescreen a little bit for wanting to just, have more control over media access and the public reception of kind of information. They can frame what they want, how they want. They don't have to address injuries if they don't want to address injuries in practice. If guys are struggling, they don't have to address that. They can frame the narrative how they want to frame it. The fact that Barry Odom is opening so many of his practices, and he's a smart guy who's well regarded across the SEC, if it was really a competitive disadvantage for them to do that and dangerous to their chances of success, they wouldn't be doing it. So I think it has more to do with athletic departments. We're talking from official school websites, as you know, to other things. Some coaches have their own websites, just an encroachment of these official school-sponsored media sites and media policies kind of encroaching on what we do as independent reporters. And, I understand it. That's just something that we've got to deal with, but it is a little bit frustrating for sure.
Let's talk Kentucky football. Kentucky won 10 games last year, had its best football season in 40 seasons. How has that changed things for Kentucky in terms of recruiting?
Well, Mark Stoops has from the first year when he was in Lexington, he's put together the best classes that Kentucky has ever had, at least since Rivals has been tracking recruits. Before that, Kentucky was pretty consistently in the 50s or 60s nationally in terms of recruiting rankings, which, was borne out on the field. Had a lot of 2, 3, 4, 5 win seasons. And Mark Stoops comes in, and his first class on 2 months' notice was, I think, 29th in the country. His second class was 17th, which is still a high water mark. Right now, I think they're in the top 20, and they have a chance to finish in the top 15. So he's always been a great recruiter. He's always brought great recruiters onto his staff. That's been really the prime consideration when he's made off-season hires. And it's hard to argue with the results last season. As far as how it's helped them now, they have the highest-rated recruit in Kentucky football history. Justin Rogers, the number one player in Michigan, picked Kentucky over Georgia and Alabama. He's a defensive tackle, offensive lineman. They got a Rivals 100 defensive lineman, Samuel Anele, who decommitted from Miami and picked Kentucky over Georgia and Auburn. So I guess before this year, it was mostly Kentucky and Ohio as the recruiting strategy. And now you're seeing them legitimately beat out some real college football recruiting powerhouses in different states that they hadn't previously had success in.
Justin, let's talk about this season. Of course, last year was tremendous for reasons discussed, but Kentucky also has raised the floor of the program in recent years. You talked about recruiting. That's been consistently good. Before the 10-win season, there were 2 7-6 seasons. There were a pair of 4-4 SEC marks in those seasons. But on the other hand, that's a historic amount of talent to bite off if Kentucky loses. You lose the National Defensive Player of the Year in Josh Allen. I think an entire starting secondary that was really good and one of the better running backs, if not offensive players in the history of that program in Benny Snell. So on one hand, you have a floor of success that seems to be there. On the other hand, you have some losses in a volume in terms of just massive talents that Kentucky probably hasn't lost in 40 years either. How do you size up where they are from a competitive standpoint heading into this year?
So on the one hand, I think they're actually going to be okay at running back. Benny Snell is going to be hard to replace, but there's some give and take with that. When Benny Snell is your primary running back, you know two things. One is good, one is not as good, and the good far outweighs the bad, just to be clear. The good is, if you need 30 carries for him, he's going to give it to you, and he's going to win every scrum at the line of scrimmage where if he needs to get 2 yards, he's going to get 3. And you can't rely on a lot of backs to do that. I mean, he was just incredibly reliable, and he got stronger as the game and the moment got more intense. The biggest thing is going to be replacing the leadership that came with his personality and just how hyper motivated that he was. Josh Allen, on the other hand, linebacker number 7 pick in the draft, Jacksonville Jaguars. I would make a case for the season that he had last year as the best season for any individual Kentucky football player of all time. And we're talking Tim Couch, number 1 draft pick, Randall Cobb. I think Josh Allen was single-handedly worth, I would say, 2 to 3 wins last season. If you watch Kentucky play, he absolutely took over the second half of games and could not be blocked. I mean, Penn State had a month to prepare for him. He had 3 sacks. Mississippi State was charged with 50 yards in penalties in the second half alone trying to block him, and a couple of turnovers. And there's just nobody that can do what he did. Kentucky's never had a guy like him. They may never have another guy like him. What I will say, 2 things working in Kentucky's favor. This is the deepest across the board that I've ever seen them, and that's a credit to recruiting because they've recruited so well. They've been able to develop these guys for longer. So they might be young, or inexperienced, but they've been in the program for a couple of years. And then the other thing is they're going to be better up front on the lines, offensive and defensive line, than most of the teams they play. They're going to have one of the best offensive lines in the SEC, and this is on paper the best defensive line that I've ever seen Kentucky have. They're going to go 3 deep with a couple of all-SEC candidates in Quentin Bohanna and Calvin Taylor. And then the third thing is the schedule. It's probably the most favorable schedule I've ever seen Kentucky have. So I think the team is not going to be as good as it was last year, but they could still win 9 games in the regular season.
Let's talk offense for a minute. Let's start with quarterback Terry Wilson, obviously very talented, but also erratic and almost just reduced to a game manager at times. I remember watching Vandy in Kentucky on TV last year, and I know the wind played into it, plus the fact that was a low-scoring game, but it just seemed that they didn't trust him to do anything. Where is he now heading into fall camp?
That's a big question. The other day, quarterbacks coach, co-offensive coordinator Darren Hinshaw told the quarterbacks club that he was speaking at the event there that he threw it about 20 times a game last year, a little bit more. He's okay with him throwing it 40 times a game this year. And, I mean, for that to happen, he's going to have to be a better passer than he was a year ago. He won the Florida game. He and Josh Allen, Benny Snell. Terry Wilson was spectacular in the Swamp. And he was good at the end of the season against Louisville, which isn't saying much. But you're right, he was a game manager. He was actually very accurate on short to mid-range throws, and he is a dynamic runner who is only occasionally dynamic as a runner. But he was a very bad deep ball thrower. And when you don't have that in your offensive arsenal, when defenses don't have to respect you going over the top and the safeties can creep up, that really limits what an offense can do. And he didn't turn it over a lot, didn't make a whole lot of mistakes, but he has got to become a better downfield passer. And the coaches hope that experience makes him better at going from read 1 to read 2 and sometimes read 3. Not making a ton of mistakes, but sometimes taking a sack that he doesn't need to, or running out of bounds, or too many throwaways. He's just got to become a little bit quicker, and he's got to get better on that deep ball.
Well, the other issue I see for them, they get back Lynn Bowden, who's a pretty good player. They lose C.J. Conrad, who was a nice safety blanket. Snell was a nice dump-off target. They lose the number 2, 3, 4, and 5 pass catchers off that offense last year. How big of a deal is that?
Well, I think the receiving options will be better than a year ago. Snell wasn't really a receiving option out of the backfield. Conrad was the predominant tight end, but it's kind of a running joke over his career that, we saw his talent, and he's probably going to be an NFL player, and everybody's wondering why don't they get him the ball more. But I guess Lynn Bowden, the one thing I would say is he's probably the best returning receiver that Kentucky has had in at least a decade, which isn't saying a whole lot again, but he could be an all-SEC player, and he really took his game to another level at the end of last season, and I think that's going to help Wilson a lot. But there are questions across the board in terms of the other receivers. Josh Ali and Isaiah Epps are older, but those guys on the outside have a lot to prove. I think the backs will be okay. The offensive line will be good. Bowden will be potentially very good. Maybe the best player on the team, Lynn Bowden is, I would say. But the outside receivers definitely have a lot to prove, and they didn't help him out a lot last year.
Let's move to defense for a moment. You talked about Josh Allen and just the eye-popping things he did a year ago. Obviously, most programs don't lose a player like that without it leaving a mark. I see secondary as being a challenge for them. I remember very clearly having you on a podcast 2 years ago and saying, hey, this is kind of the under the radar story, but that defensive backfield has got a chance to be really good. And of course, last year it was. All 4 starters gone. That's kind of tough too, because with one guy, you may try to replace him with a committee or another thing, but losing 4 starters in a league with some pretty good quarterbacks, that appears to be an area where that's going to be a little bit of a problem for them.
Yeah, a little bit might be an understatement, Chris. That's a potential crisis area, I would say. And they're going to play some good quarterbacks in the SEC, some good skill players, certainly at Vanderbilt and elsewhere. They lose their top 6 defensive backs from last year. They were hoping Devontae Robinson at safety would come back and potentially be kind of all SEC player. He's 6'2", explosive athleticism. And he just a few days ago, he tore a quad. He had a serious quad injury, and he's out for the season. And so they've got young talent at safety, but it's very young, not a whole lot of experience. And at cornerback, there is nothing in the way of experience. They brought in a couple of junior college transfers. Brandon Eccles will probably be a starter. Quandre Mosley, probably number 4 corner, I would say. Cedric Dort was a high school prospect a few years ago. He missed last season with a high ankle sprain that caused him to redshirt at the beginning of the season. And then they've got Jamari Brown, redshirt freshman from Florida, but not as much size as people are accustomed to Kentucky having the secondary. They just had these 6'2", 6'3", 6'4" freak athletes at cornerback, and that's not going to be the case. And they're going to be very inexperienced. And I would say, just on paper, it's going to be a problem slowing down opposing passing attacks, and you're going to see them giving a lot of soft zone coverage to kind of minimize the damage.
Well, the other thing you can do is if you can generate a pass rush. And I know you mentioned the defensive line is good. They've got Cash Daniel back, who's a pretty good player. How much hope is there that Kentucky can find other ways to offset the loss of all those defensive backs?
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem is the strength of the defense is going to be the defensive line. They go probably 7 to 8 deep with a 3-man front, and it's a very gifted, physical, mature unit. But schematically, those guys are playing gap assignments, and they just haven't been asked to kind of pin their ears back and get after the quarterback. That's just not what Kentucky's defensive linemen just do schematically. They rely a lot on those edge rushers, the jack defender, the sandbacker, to get after the quarterback. And they got outside linebacker Boogie Watson, who had 5.5 sacks a year ago. He's not Josh Allen, but he's a pretty solid player. They're strong up the middle at linebacker with Cash Daniel and young guys, DeAndre Square and Chris Oates, accomplished recruits, really athletic, physical guys. But I would say generating a pass rush is, again, going to be a question. It's not going to be as good a pass rush as there was a year ago with Josh Allen, 17 sacks, the all-time and the single-season sack leader in Kentucky history. If you're looking for a theme on the defense, up the middle on the defensive line, inside linebacker, safety, they're pretty strong. But on the edge, they're not deep and they're inexperienced. So if you can stretch them out, you can get to the sideline, you can play on the perimeter, that's where the worry would be.
This time of year, the preseason narratives get recycled. Everybody reads the same thing in the magazines and such. Is there a storyline or two out there around the program that maybe isn't getting enough discussion?
That's a good question. I would say the one thing that the coaches keep coming back to in terms of a storyline is last year was about proving that team was for real. This year, they're taking this as a chip on their shoulders to prove that the program is for real. And these coaches are calculating in how they do this, but they take offense at a lot of things publicly. When they feel like they're getting shots. For example, they've beaten South Carolina 5 years in a row. They've beaten Missouri 4 years in a row, and they are very quick to point out that every year South Carolina and Missouri are projected to do better than they are. But they say we keep beating them. We keep beating them is their mantra. I think there's some truth to that. I don't think it's the whole story. But yeah, I mean, I would say this year is just big picture, probably a bridge year for Kentucky. The schedule is very favorable to them. if they can get through this year, get this recruiting class in, which could be historically good, 2020 could set up to be a very good year for them because they return almost everybody from this team the following season.
Okay, I'm going to go to a couple of questions from our mailbag. That's sponsored by Vanderbilt fan Josh Minton, an independent insurance agent operating out of Brentwood. Looking for a one-stop shop to take care of your insurance needs? Josh has got you covered. Call him today, 615-933-1979. Email him at josh@hqinsurance.com. Follow him on Twitter at Joshua Minton HQ or Facebook at facebook.com/JD Minton HQ. He's my insurance agent. Give him a try. Tell him you heard about it here. Also, give Josh a call or an email and see if you can help out with Camp Horizon. That is the camp for kids with cancer that Josh helps put on. They are looking for sponsors, and I know Josh would very much appreciate your support of that. Okay, Door King asks, how have stadium upgrades affected Kentucky's program, especially with regards to attendance and recruiting?
It's really interesting because nationally there has been the drop-off in college football attendance, and Kentucky is no exception to that. You know, when Mark Stoops first got to Kentucky, they had 50,000 people show up for the first spring game, and that was, I mean, previous to that, it was like 3,000 to 5,000. It was just, it's night and day. It was the first taste of a big-time college football environment. And then for the next 3 or so years, even as the facilities were being upgraded, it was really a story of disappointment. They would start strong, 5-1, 4-2, and then they would just collapse down the stretch. And that really depressed and suppressed fan excitement and enthusiasm. And so even during the 10-3 season, I mean, they were, I want to say 8-3 at the time after losing to Georgia and Tennessee. They played on Senior Day in Kroger Field, now formerly Commonwealth Stadium, and there were just a ton of empty seats. And so the good news for Kentucky is season tickets are way up this year. We'll see if the fans stay bought in. I think the facilities more than anything helped with recruiting. Not sure. They've actually decreased the stadium capacity from 67,000 to 60,000. It's made for a better environment for the people who go, but it's had more of an impact on recruiting than turnout, I would say.
Next question from Mr. Vandy. What does the running back situation look like this season without Benny Snell?
Yeah. A.J. Rose is a redshirt sophomore who had a similar ranking to Snell. Both are from Ohio. He's an explosive back. If you look at like Pro Football Focus data, the analytics in terms of broken tackles matched Snell in far fewer carries. He has the speed to run away from defensive backs. He's also 6'2", 200 pounds, kind of a physical specimen. The question is, how much of a load can he carry, and can he stretch out the smaller sample size success to a bigger role in the offense? But I think people think Rose can be a 1,000-yard back. I would say the X factor to watch out for is Cavossier Smoke, who redshirted last season, but he's a guy who ordinarily, I mean, he would have been at Auburn if Auburn didn't have a couple of running back commitments. I'm told, everybody around the program is just raving about this guy, and they keep on saying this guy is the kind of back that you see at Auburn. And I wouldn't be shocked if Cavossier Smoke, that 6 foot, 220, 230 pounds with breakaway speed, takes on more and more of the carries as the season goes on. I think losing Snell is tough, but they're actually pretty good at running back.
Justin, let's talk hoops and then a little baseball before I let you go. What's the state of things at UK? I know that the fans are probably a little disappointed there haven't been more national titles and things like that, but it just seems like every year it's the same story. He's got a number 1 or 2 recruiting class that's got them in position to contend as always. What's the temperature around that program in terms of how John Calipari has met or not met expectations?
Well, I ran a very scientific, that's a joke, Twitter poll at the end of last season when they lost to Auburn in overtime in the Elite Eight in Kansas City. And, thousands of responses, and I think Calipari had a 97% approval rating. And at Kentucky, for the head basketball coach to have that kind of approval rating, I mean, I think I would have thought it was impossible, a certain amount of time ago. And that's after 4 consecutive seasons of not reaching the Final Four. I break the Calipari era up into three segments. The first was when he first got there and he was just getting whoever he wanted Wall, Cousins, those guys. And they went to, I don't remember how many Final Fours in the first so many years, but they won the national title and all these number one picks, and everybody was on cloud nine. And then Duke, when Jeff Capel was hired there, Duke kind of took the reins as the recruiting power nationally. A lot of those guys that were going to Kentucky started going to Duke, and it reflected on the court. And I think that Calipari's entered a third phase where he's weathered some of the worst and some of the criticism. And he's in a position, Eric Bossi with Rivals said today, they're probably going to have the number one class in 2020. They just got a commitment from the number 10 player, BJ Boston, where they're surging again, recruiting. And they're getting back, it seems like, to the recruiting success that they had before. I will say this, 2 out of the last 3 years, they had a chance to win it last year. And then 3 years ago, they were one Luke May shot away from probably being the favorite in the Final Four after losing to North Carolina. So all you can ask for from a coach is to be in the hunt year after year. And if you look at his tournament record in March, there's no coach that's consistently put them in contention nationally as much as Calipari. But no question, kind of like Dean Smith, you get to the end of his time at Kentucky, if he only has one title to show for it, people are going to say that was underachieving, and it would be right on some level.
I want to ask you a similar question about baseball because, of course, you've got Vanderbilt in the East, you've got Florida, 2 of the top 5 national powers. You've got Georgia has been a top 10 program the last couple of years. Tennessee is getting competitive again. And, of course, all those schools in the West are pretty good most years, too. It's a hard place to win in a lot of ways, but there's also the interesting dynamic of being the northernmost team in the SEC and maybe being able to dip into Ohio and Indiana and some places like that, just geographically. I like their coach, Mingione. I think he's done a pretty good job. It's a tough situation. They just built a new facility that from TV has looked nice. But it's just been a weird thing because it's been kind of hot and cold there. Where do you feel that program is headed?
Well, 2 years ago, after Minjone's first season, he was like 43-23, and they had a super regional, and they were second in the East, and that was his first year, and people were kind of like, okay, this is the guy. And in hindsight, I think a lot of people that really followed it closely recognized at the time that he inherited a pretty stacked baseball team, and it's been downhill since. They've gotten worse by about 10 games each of the last 2 years to the point they were last in the East, 7-23 in the conference this past season, and they just had a huge staff turnover. They had a top 10 recruiting class, but they parted ways with Roland Fanning, their recruiting coordinator, and the class seems to be falling apart. They lost their pitching coach to Florida State, and, this is kind of potentially a make-it-or-break-it year for Mingione. If he doesn't get things start ticking back in the right direction, then facility upgrades, first-year success, you're not going to be able to ignore the downward trend line. So it's a very important year here for his future, and certainly the SEC doesn't do a coach any favors.
Justin, great stuff. Thanks for joining us today. Tell people about what's coming up at Cats Illustrated that might be of interest to Vanderbilt fans. Give us your Twitter account, anything else you'd like to promote before you leave.
Well, we're always heavy into recruiting and team analytics, but just for Vanderbilt fans, we do try to cover the SEC at large, and we've previewed Vanderbilt with the help of Chris, and we're going to do more of that as the season comes along. And if you ever have any interest in anything Kentucky, we've usually got something on the front page that will make you a smarter SEC basketball or football fan, and you can follow me at Rowland Rivals. So appreciate that, and maybe I'll interact with some of you moving forward.
You bet. Thanks a bunch, Justin.
Thanks a lot.
He's Justin Rowland. I'm Chris Lee, host of the Vandy Sports Podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll have more episodes coming later in the week.